Good morning, U.S. history students. How are you all doing? Just some updates before we get going on today's lecture. The quarter will end on Tuesday, March 31st. You have two more grades coming to you. Friday, there will be a DBQ scaffolding. I think it's a 14 set of questions that will be due by 5 p.m. I will post it on Friday at 8. Monday we will wrap up the lecture, and then Tuesday we will take our test on World War I, which will be your last grade of the third quarter. If there are any questions or issues with that, make sure you're emailing me and let me know what is going on. I'm also going to put together Google Meets for us either Thursday or Friday to serve as a review and just to kind of check in on each other. We're going to do it one class at a time so that we don't have over 100 students all trying to talk at once. So I will get back to you on that. And don't worry, I'll put the times in the middle of the day so you guys can all get your beauty rest. All right, so let's get into this. World War I is the unit. Woodrow Wilson will be the wartime president in America. He was president number 3 of the progressive presidents. He's a Democrat, though, because of the Bull Moose Teddy versus Taft situation in 1912. That is going to give the election, split their vote and give the election to Woodrow Wilson. So he is going to continue with a strong foreign policy in Latin America. He talks about American intervention in the terms of religion and also democracy. So he believes in the idea that God has pushed America sort of as the city upon a hill, the shining light to help the rest of the world in liberating them. Of course, keep in mind there's always the backdrop of economics and making money and business. So just think about that as we go forward. Now, you guys are probably learned a lot about World War I during Global 10, I'm assuming. So I'm not going to harp that much on the European side of the war. Now, America gets involved in the war very, very late, so there's actually more to talk about in terms of America's pathway to the war than actually going to war. Okay? But if you remember, Arch Archduke Franz Ferdinand gets assassinated in June of 1914. He was heir to the throne of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in Sarajevo, Bosnia, and that is going to set off a chain of events that's going to plunge Europe into war. Now, the backdrop to this is colonialism. So the major powers of the world are now moving around the world, looking for natural resources, looking for military bases, looking for countries to trade with. The poorer countries of the world are going to be the targets. So Middle East, Latin America, various countries in Asia are going to be ripe for takeover. Now, the more the major powers are out on the high seas competing with each other, the more chance there will be for conflict. More chance there is for conflict, more need for friends. And by friends, we're talking about the alliance system. So if you think about it in terms of your worlds, you guys all have friend groups. Sometimes friend groups compete with other friend groups for various things, social status, the table in the cafeteria, whatever it might be. Okay? So the idea of friendship is that what happens to one of your friends also happens to you. And you can show your loyalty that way and your love for your friends by sticking by them in hard times. So when one person, in the teenage years winds up fighting another person, it can often turn into multiple people fighting because of the alliance system. So it's just sort of a microcosm of what was going on in Europe. You mess with my friend, you mess with me. So one country sees an aggressive action, their friends don't like it, they start pushing back against the country that was the aggressor and their friends, and the next thing you know, instead of one country fighting one country, we now have many countries fighting many countries, which then spills over into what's called a world war. Okay? So the sides here are Britain, France, Russia, and Japan, which became the Allies, versus Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire, which includes modern-day Turkey and much of the Middle East as the central powers. So you have like the sponsor nations, and you also have some of their satellite or colonialized nations involved in this war as well. Now, This is the first modern war. The amount of death is astronomical, and a major reason for that is the technology in weaponry that is going to be available. So submarines, airplanes. Now, airplanes are mostly used for reconnaissance at this point, not for actual bombing. Tanks, machine guns, poison gas produces unprecedented slaughter. Now, German forces, now Germany is a major military machine. They are going to be able to, they are very good builders of things, ingenuity in terms of engineering. So they can build weapons, they can mobilize forces, and they are going to be the aggressors early in this war. They're in Central Europe. They're strategically located to be able to push in different directions, and they are going to be able to overrun Belgium and northern France very, very quickly. Now, the Allies are going to kind of put their foot in the ground and turn the Germans back, or at least keep them where they are. And World War I is a series of trench battles. Okay, and I'll put some stuff up about trenches in a moment. But trench battles are basically large, 6 and 8 foot encampments, if you will, that stretch for various miles, that hold the troops. And the moving of the trench lines back and forth created this stalemate where no one was really winning and no one was really losing, but more and more people were dying for very, very little territory. Okay? Now, just to give you some scale here, if you read the third bullet point, in one 5-month battle in Verdun, France in 1916, 600,000 French and German soldiers died in 6 months. 5 months. That's as many as died in the entire American Civil War. Okay, so just to give you some scale and scope, and in the Civil War, we talked about the bloodiest battles of Gettysburg, the bloodiest single day of Antietam. Now we have 600,000 dying in this war in one 5-month battle. So by the end of the war, we're going to have 10 million soldiers dead, uncounted millions of civilians, followed by the worldwide epidemic of influenza that killed an estimated 21 million or more. And it's interesting because with this coronavirus outbreak, they've been talking a lot about that flu. That was the Spanish flu, not because it came from the Spanish, but because it was transmitted most from that country after the war. So everybody comes back to their own countries after the war, bringing all the germs and diseases that the war produced. So the flu winds up being a bigger killer than the machine guns of World War I because they have no vaccine, they have little connectivity like we do today to talk to each other and the scientific community. So that is going to be a major issue. Now, I've seen estimates of 50 to 100 million when it comes to that Spanish flu. Just some of the weapons here, tanks for World War I, some of the machine guns that are going to be used by the different sides in World War I. Now, America, from George Washington, our foreign policy was going to be neutrality, especially when it came to Europe. Europe was always looked at as more powerful and a little bit more unstable. We were over here for a reason. One ocean on either side is a buffer. We don't want to get involved. Now, we don't want to get involved because we don't want to pick sides, but the backdrop also is that we want to trade with both sides because we are the #1 producer of goods in the world. So if war stimulates the need for goods, you don't want to just trade with one side, you want to trade with both because both will buy your goods at an increased amount because we are in a time of war. Okay. Now, Americans are going to be sharply divided over the war because we have people from these various countries all throughout America. Just think of New York City and the Lower East Side alone. So we have our ties to British because of our roots to them. They practice liberty and democracy there just like we do. The German Americans are going to be on the side of Germany. The Irish Americans don't want to help the British because of British oppression in Ireland. Russian immigrants hate Russia because of oppression against the Jews. Pacifists, feminists, social reformers, religious leaders all oppose American intervention in the war. So some say, yes, let's go. Some say, no, let's not go. Now, the Lusitania. We're talking about the naval powers on the seas, right? That's what we were talking about during the 1890s. That's what we're still talking about. That's how trade is conducted. Now, when war breaks out, there's an increased likelihood that trade will get disrupted. Now, if a trade ship or a merchant ship is taken over by one side of this war or the other, do you go to war to defend yourself? Do you use diplomacy and try to say, hey, why are you doing that? Stop doing that. But if you think about it from the perspective of Britain or France or Germany, they are helping themselves by stopping an American ship that's going to trade with the other side. So Britain is going to order a naval blockade of Germany, which begins to stop American merchant ships. And America is going to realize over these next couple of years that neutrality is a lot more difficult than it sounds when you're trying to trade with both sides. So the Germans are going to sink a British ship, or many British ships, including the Lusitania in May of 1915, which was carrying a large cache of arms, death of 1,200 passengers, and 124 United States citizens. So America was involved in trading with these companies. There were some Americans on this ship, and the Germans are sinking this ship with their new technology, which was the submarine. So if you think that this can happen to one ship, this can happen to many ships, perhaps all ships. Submarine warfare is something that the world had never seen. People didn't understand it. This is going to spark American outrage to enter the war. Teddy Roosevelt throws his weight behind it. Now keep in mind, America is loaning large sums of money to Britain. If Britain were to get, now we're backing the side that yes, we're closer to, but also the side that we think can win. So if you think about it, if the Germans, and they are winning early in the war, if they can overrun the Allied powers, then will those loans be paid back? That $2 billion that we gave them, will it be paid back? No. All right. So Wilson is going to begin a preparedness program to expand the American Army and the Navy and get ready for war. The Lusitania was kind of the wake-up call that neutrality may not work, and if it doesn't work, we better be ready to defend ourselves and to get over there and defend our interests. That's a picture of the Lusitania, and this is the New York Times. Now, the New York Times and various other papers are going to be pushing this crisis, and the whole concept of yellow journalism and sensationalism is going to play back into this. All right, so the road to war. May of 1916, Germany is going to announce the suspension of submarine warfare against non-combatants, meaning that if you're not involved in the war with your military, then you are not going to have your ships taken out by the German submarines. This is a victory for Wilson because it makes it look like, by him building up his army and his navy, that the Germans were somewhat fearful of America's involvement in the war, and they basically called off their unrestricted submarine warfare. As a result, Wilson is going to win re-election in 1916, calling for peace without victory in Europe. So he's basically calling for a stalemate of the war, saying that, that let's just go back to the way things were without needing an actual victor in this war. Now, January of 1917, Germany is going to resume submarine warfare, sinks a few American merchant ships, thinks that the blockade of British would kill Britain before American forces could arrive. They were wrong. So they basically call off submarine warfare so that America kind of de-escalates. Then they kick it back up again, shoot down a few American ships, because they figure if they can surround the British with a blockade and choke off supply to Britain, then they could defeat the British before the American forces could arrive. They were very, very sensitive to the idea that if the Americans got involved, that would tip the war in the scale or to the side of the Allies. Now, last but not least, the Zimmermann telegram. March of 1917, British spies intercepted and made public the Zimmermann telegram, which was a message by German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann calling on Mexico to join in the coming war against the U.S. and promising its territory from the Mexican-American War back, such as Texas, Arizona, New Mexico, Colorado, Southern California. All right. Now, April of 1917, Wilson asked Congress to declare war against Germany, and the Senate voted yes, 82-6. Now, the Zimmermann telegram is going to be very widespread in the media. It puts a lot of pressure on Wilson that the Germans are now trying to stir up war on the North American continent. And the Germans figured that if the Mexicans waged war with their help against us on our southern border, that would split up our military and be a further reason why America couldn't send forces to Europe to swing the tide against the Germans and the Central Powers. Read through the Zimmerman telegram, please.